We are here at beautiful and historic Maker's Mark Distillery. Maker's Mark began when Bill Samuels Sr. purchased the Burke's Distillery in 1953 in Loretto, Kentucky. Production began in 1954 and the first run was bottled in 1958 under the brand's dipped red wax seal. The brand is still produced right here today in Loretto, Kentucky, and the bottles are still hand-dipped in the iconic red wax. Rob Samuels took over as Chief Distillery Officer from his dad, Bill Samuel Jr., in 2011. To tell you more about the distillery and the future plans, here's Rob with the State of the Makers address.
To really appreciate my grandparents, Bill and Margie Samuels, who settled here in Marion County 65 years ago with a dream and a vision to elevate bourbon to a place it had never been before, it's helpful to understand a bit of the history and what led up to 1953 after they had acquired hundreds of acres here in Marion County. Our family, the Samuels, we had actually produced whiskey for several hundred years. We actually made whiskey in Scotland, had made whiskey in Pennsylvania for more than a century, had owned and operated a distillery not far from here for more than a century. That distillery, as all of the others in Kentucky at that time, produced equally rough, aggressive, blow your ears off whiskey. And thankfully, my grandparents really weren't inspired by making a commodity. He fundamentally, in who he was as a person, he was a craftsman. And his dream and vision was to elevate bourbon, to create a soft, rich, handmade bourbon that you could hold on your tongue without the aggressiveness. And that, in many ways, was their guiding light as they settled here. They looked down upon the valley here, and he poured his heart and soul into the distillery, and within each of the steps of the process within making whiskey, better understanding where flavor comes from, what could he do differently? And here at the distillery today, we still employ each and every step of his purposefully inefficient process, only using water from a natural source, soft red winter wheat as a flavoring grain, a roller mill to grind the grain so as not to scorch the grain, slow cook process, our Samuels family yeast strain that's been in the family for more than 170 years. Only distillery in the world that I know of that actually rotates barrels through the maturation process. And then it's our tasting panel, which in the beginning was one man and today is made up of 24 of our most palate discerning team members. They tell us when it's time to bottle. But he was a whiskey maker who had a very clear sense of a style of bourbon that he hoped to achieve. And then it was my grandmother who did everything else. And she was the one who thought that the home of his handmade bourbon should celebrate those same values, the authenticity, and what more endearing personal way to connect than to have friends come visit. So she dreamed that the home here, much like you would your own personal home. And she has since been credited with inventing bourbon tourism. And she set it up from the very beginning so that they could swing open the doors and have friends experience each and every step of the process. And she would later go on to create the Maker's Mark name and bottle design. And each and every bottle that we hand dip today looks exactly as the very first. And while the bottle and the name and the package is exactly the same, from hand tearing labels and hand dipping every bottle, what I'm most proud of is the whiskey that we make today here at our National Historic Landmark Distillery is made exactly as it was in the very beginning. So in many ways, when my grandparents stood here 65 years ago, their dream and vision was responsible for so much more than the creation of one brand. It truly was the beginning of the modern era of bourbon. What I'm really proud of is that we have retained the vision of our founders at the center as the guiding light for the future of who Maker's Mark will become. And some examples of how we celebrate our founders' vision here on site include we now have art on display by more than 80 different artists. Dale Chihuly, the world-renowned glass blower, actually has 2 permanent installations here at the distillery. Within the warehouse setting, after the tasting, Dale Chihuly created with his team the Spirit of the Maker, which is made up of 1,258 individual hand-blown pieces of glass. There's a beautiful, subtle little ribbon of red that weaves its way through the installation. The blues celebrate the water source. The browns, the golds, the ambers celebrate the soft red winter wheat. That installation was unveiled in celebration of the brand's 60th anniversary and to celebrate the handmade essence of our founders and what they envisioned when first settling here. And the artist, Dale Chihuly, as we unveiled that sculpture together, he whispered in my ear that in his opinion, this installation at Maker's Mark and the environment is the most inspired of any of his pieces in his entire career. In the Glass Conservatory, as we welcome our friends here on site at Maker's Mark, Dale Chihuly created the oak and amber chandelier installation. We recently collaborated with Peter Eichhorn, who is an artist from Germany who's been here in Kentucky for 50 years, sort of tucked away. And Peter created a stained glass installation made up of more than 1,000 pieces that comes together through the mark of the maker on display in our historic Cypress fermenter room, and the rays of light that transcend through that installation in many ways celebrate the legacy of our founders and their vision in that important moment of fermentation, when all the sugars convert to alcohol and so much of the defining flavor of Maker's Mark begins to happen. You know, we're a brand here that for more than 58 years, we only made one product. And the average bourbon distillery makes dozens and dozens. And it was my father, 8 years ago, Bill Samuels, who was president of Maker's Mark for more than 40 years. I believe his greatest legacy here at Maker's Mark you experience as you step inside the distillery. And he was adamant that as we started thinking about growth beyond the capacity of our original distillery, that we not be mindful of how do you get more efficient as you grow, but how do you retain the purposeful inefficiency through the process and the consistency of the whiskey over time. And it was his vision that we actually create a mirror image, a second distillery identical to the first, with same commitment, same process, equals same consistency over time. And he later would begin to talk a little bit about creating his perfect expression of Maker's Mark and really understanding in a more meaningful, deeper way the true flavors and characteristics that come together that define who Maker's Mark is organoleptically. And he started asking questions of a bigger, bolder bourbon, a bourbon that would have a bit of a longer finish, but one that you still wouldn't have to wouldn't be hard to like. And could he accentuate some of the flavors and characteristics that he enjoys the most that live within Maker's Mark? And it was through exploration over several years. I will admit that the exploration was a lot of fun because almost everything we made was pretty damn good. And he was adamant that for his expression that it would have to be a wow. And his creation, Maker's 46, was born through that experimentation. The 46 finishing stave, which is a 200-year-old French oak stave that's seared with radiant heat. We didn't know it at the time, but that finishing can only occur at 50 degrees or cooler, which is why we later decided to create the industry's first ever limestone whiskey cellar, where we actually carved through the limestone shelf here at the heart of the campus and created a finishing space for Maker's 46, a first of its kind in the industry. And it was through this vision that we actually later would release Private Select, which is the industry's very first ever custom barrel program. And then of course, in the fall of 2016, finally, we as a distillery in Kentucky are able to serve cocktails. And we are honored to partner with a leading chef who's local but chased his dreams all over the world, and we've transformed a historic home here on property to have a leading culinary and cocktail program as part of how our friends experience Maker's Mark. While we have hosted visitors here at our National Historic Landmark Distillery for decades, the reason that our founders chose to settle and make this the home of their bourbon, we've never before opened to the public. We have two water sources, two lakes which supply all of the water that goes into making each and every drop of our handmade bourbon. And as we think about the future and the guiding light of our founders and their vision, we are exploring thoughtful ways to open up our nature preserve and water sanctuary and provide, as part of how you would experience Maker's Mark, that opportunity to experience how nature influences the whiskey, from the water and the oak and the wheat here on site. It's always felt like we've had lots and lots of visitors. I mean, I remember working here as a youngster, actually as a tour guide, and it always felt like we were busy. At those times, most all of our guests were locals from this community, from throughout Kentucky, and with the renaissance of American whiskey and Kentucky bourbon in particular, the culture, the defining culture of Kentucky, and it's that combination of bourbon and horses and the food and even the music and how it all comes together. We've always loved the Kentucky culture, but today it's drawing people from all over the world that can go anywhere and do anything to come experience here with us. You know, we're blessed that we live in an era where so many products across any industry are almost created by marketers. But our founders were not marketers, they were not commercial people. And what we do here is real. And to open up the doors here and have our friends experience the authenticity and the richness here on site is pretty powerful. Our vision is more about how do we take folks deeper into the authenticity versus hosting more and more guests. Yeah, I think we will over time host more visitors. I mean, today we host almost twice as many as we did 5 years ago, but we're focused more on how do we experience more of the layers that come together to make up who Maker's Mark is. And I think that's what the majority of our guests are most interested in, which is why we've begun to offer so many more beyond the core hour-long tour and tasting. There are comprehensive tours where you can spend a full afternoon with us on site and actually live what it's like to be Maker's Mark through each and every step of the process, and extend with a dinner or a wonderful cocktail here on site and enjoy the view and the setting as part of experiencing Kentucky.